Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. This episode is the second half of my conversation with comedian and impressionist Josh Berry. So if you haven't listened to the previous episode, there's a link to that in the show notes. I'd recommend you do that first because this is, well, very much a continuation of what we talked about there. In this part of our discussion, Josh gives us a glimpse into his thought processes and how his curiosity about human decision-making drives his comedy. What you're about to hear are some fascinating insights from inside a comedian's mind. And as you'll know, Josh is thoughtful, intelligent, and very engaging. I'll repeat the warning from part one. There is some adult language used here, so listener discretion is advised. With that said, here's part two of my discussion with Josh Berry on comedy, satire, and impressions. The book, cunningly, I noticed, presents itself as there's options for future diaries to come. Is that something you're actively thinking about? Was it so you just want to take a little break at the moment?
Yeah.
I mean, 2021's not over yet, right? So
that's true.
It would be wrong to start writing that now.
Sure.
But...
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. No, I mean, it was bloody hell. It was so intense, that process. But then equally, it was the first book I've ever written, so maybe the second one wouldn't be as intense. But I can imagine listening back to this in a year's time, being like, "You idiot." It was definitely intense. Yeah, I think. But the thing is, there's no time limit on this, is there? Which is good. I mean, like, I definitely would like to return to Rafe in some sort of book format or in some sort of longer form format at some point. But I think it's like it's a bit like Adrian Mole, right? Like, you come back to Adrian Mole at various points during his life, and it's interesting, and it's interesting what he's going through relative to the age and stage he's at, and I can imagine plenty of stuff in my life being interesting, and I could sort of bleed that into Rafe, and for example, like at 30 or having kids and a family, and there's plenty of funny stuff, or when Rafe inevitably has a massive breakdown. At some point. There's plenty of funny stuff there. There's plenty of funny stuff in terms of his sexuality that I would quite like to explore. I think there's plenty of sort of amusing fertile ground and things you could make him think and feel and do. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely not. I'm definitely not done. And it's interesting whether sort of he becomes, he moves outside of politics. Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't. I don't know, but. Yeah, I love writing the character. I love his view on the world. I think the thing is, I need to experience a bit more life. I need to observe a bit more life in order to inform future stuff that I'm doing. So, like when Chris Morris wrote Four Lions, he literally went and stayed with all those people and for 2 years, right? Like, he interviewed countless Muslims in Bradford, I think. And I feel like I did that with posh people kind of through
just by default.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't realize, but that's exactly what I was doing. And because I did impressions and stuff, I had like a really keen observational ability that I just squirreled it all away into my head and could create a sort of amalgam character, which was also based a bit on me. And also, I think, when I was at university, I was probably doing a bit of an impression of that type of person anyway, in order to fit in, because
right.
You know what I mean? So
yeah, totally.
Sort of like part of that in my head, because God, this feels like a therapy session, Christian, but I wasn't very cool at school, as you can probably imagine. And suddenly I sort of got to university and I felt like I was accepted and cool, and that sort of impression was a way of like me feeling kind of embraced, I guess, in that way. But I think I need to go and see more of these types of people in order to see where Rafe would fit in down the line.
I'm struck by the way that you describe it. There's sort of almost an anthropological element to what you do, right? Which is observing people, sure, working out what the hell they're about, and sort of building characters off that.
Yeah, I that's a very nice way of putting it. I mean, I guess I did so much of that at university, and I loved that. I used to do loads of stuff on like the anthropology of religion and the sociology of religion, and I'm really interested in people. I find people fascinating, and what makes them tick, what motivates them, and I've always found that. I've always had a really keen interest. And I know some people, particularly a lot of comedians, they don't really give a shit about people, right? Like, you see that thing where like a comedian on a chat show or whatever, and they're fucking awful because they just talk all the time. They're not interested. And a really good exception to that rule is Tommy Tiernan in I don't know if you've seen his show in Ireland, but I mean he's brilliant, right? Like such a good interviewer. But yeah, I find people so interesting. Like I like sort of, yeah, I guess that I often do that at parties. I like to survey what people think about things, and I think
I just got a vision of you walking around with a clipboard.
Almost. But what do you think about this? Because I'm just genuinely interested. Like, good examples like the Chappelle special, or the trans stuff. And I just was really interested to hear like what my friends who were comedians thought, and like what my dad thought, and what all kinds of different people thought about it. And I just find that very interesting. I don't really know why. But I think that's what's enabled me. That's what's meant I've done impressions, and it's also what's meant I've wanted to create characters, because like that analysis I find fascinating.
But I mean that's interesting because I'm interested in behavioral science because I want an explanation for what the hell is going on, and I'm looking for and it starts with why do I do these stupid? Generally not why do I make amazing decisions. It's typically why did I screw that up? Why did that happen to me? And I've got past the stage of blaming everybody else and recognizing I need to take personal responsibility. Sure. And so it almost strikes me that you're approaching it. It's the same challenge. It's like a little bit of what the hell is going on? How do I make sense of these things? And because we interact with people, that's a helpful way to work out, because ultimately people control what's going on around us, and we have to interact with them. So I think there's something really interesting the way you're sort of curious about things, which strikes me that the way you were talking about yourself when you were younger is almost like I had a similar sort of thing, which is like just I'm asking loads of questions, and for some reason that was entertained, and that I've kind of carried that into adulthood, and it strikes me that you're kind of just curious about what's going on.
Yeah, I definitely am, but particularly on that kind of social level, I find. I just find people very, very interesting, and what motivates them. I have a real interest in like vulnerability and what, sadness. I think most comedians do. I think most comedians have an interest in, but that's the age old stereotype. The reason you do comedy is because you had a sad childhood or whatever, or an ill parent, which is a bit of a cliche, but of course it's true. And normally you become a comedian because you're quite a reflective and introspective person. It's not always the case, but mostly, and to be any good, you probably tend to have to be. So it all comes from that, I think, the fact that I like reflect enormously on encounters that I will have with people and reflect enormously about other people. I don't know if other people's minds work as much like that in terms of like I just think like so much, and I guess that is a real blessing as far as comedy goes, because it your brain will like throw up like, here's this character, here's this type of person that's interesting to show to the world, and can be funny.
Replaying conversations in your head, or
sure, yeah, plenty of that, and also just like, oh, have I upset this person and all that, just pathetic, endless crap, and right. All the trauma that I have to deal with. No, but I do think it's like that's part of an adult life, isn't it? It's like clearly there's something in my psyche or my like emotional experience of the world that needs like addressing and needs to be worked through, and I feel like that's part of a responsible adult's life to try and work through those things and overcome the blockages that we have.
But it's kind of awesome that you've managed to forge a career that allows you to do that, right? Because there's tons of people out there, and you're speaking to someone who decided he was post-university going to qualify as a chartered accountant, right? Because that sounds sensible. Sure. I am still one, but would I trust myself to do a set of accounts? Probably not, right? And I look at that and go, what were you doing apart from realizing? And I wasn't very good at maths either, which was the worst bit, right?
That's very impressive to qualify.
But that was a sort of, and so I think there's something quite cool about you've managed to grab that really early on in life, and lots of people don't get to that point till much later on.
Yeah, but I think I would be, obviously it would be a misrepresentation to say that I haven't been incredibly fortunate to have specific things happen and fall into place at the right time. Like often the kindness of people like Andy Murray, the kindness of that. And don't get me wrong, I work extremely hard and have valued all the opportunities I've had, but I have still been very lucky to have a lot of opportunities. Sure, lots of people don't use those opportunities, but it is privilege that I have to thank to a very large extent. But also the kind of background that instilled me with a very hard work ethic, like that in itself was a privilege. I think, but I'm quite single-minded, and I'm quite I'm really not a ruthless person, but
which is exactly what a ruthless person would say.
Yeah. No, I'm extremely ambitious. So I have that sort of single-mindedness, and I think as soon as I sort of decided, right, I'm gonna be a comedian, like that was what I did. And I was only going to do, I did all the horrible gigs and the awful shit and, bombing and, terrible, and just being crap and people heckling, just all of that. And, but I was like, well, this is what I'm going to be. So this is just what I'm going to do. I'm just going to work and get better and keep going and all of that. So yeah, I've got quite a sort of single-minded, like I'm fine just sort of doing things by myself and just being like, this is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to do it. I'll just plug away at it. And that's fine. And now it feels kind of weird because it's like, okay, well, I'm getting all that success, which is obviously great, but it's kind of hard to know. That comes with a whole different set of pressures, right? You're like, okay, well, now I've got to do something that's better than the thing I did before. And you're like, fuck. I felt like all my life was working towards this one thing, and now another thing? What?
It is that funny thing, though, right? You climb a mountain, and that's all you can see, and then you go, shit, there's another even bigger one.
Yeah, I know, but I guess it's like the joy is just it's like the myth of Sisyphus, right? Like they're pushing the boulder up the hill. It's not getting to the top of the hill, it's pushing the boulder. And for me, like some of my happiest times are like the initial bits of a tour, or even like work in progress. Is like when a work in progress goes well, you're like, I'm working, this is good. I've got this stuff that I've written and that seems to work, but I can tighten this screw and I can get rid of that bit and trim the fat here and whatever. And I love that because it's like, that's the process. That's, you're crafting what it is you're doing. And I can't tell you how great that is. But yeah, it's like all of these things are different and enjoyable in varying different ways. Like in some ways that's really fun because you're like, right, I'm really working. And then other ways, like a completely finished show where the audience are really loving it. Maybe you're a bit bored because you've done it loads of times. But that's...
You literally know the punchlines, right?
Sure. But there's nothing better than doing a joke for the first time and an audience really loving it. When you've done it, 50, 100 times, it's less... You're a bit more like, okay, yeah, I know it's funny. My ego is sufficiently... you're not going to help redress my sad childhood with that one, guys. So yeah, I just love the process of it, and I think it's important just to remember to lose yourself in the process, and that's definitely what I did with the book. Like, I was just totally obsessed, completely obsessed.
I'm intrigued by the response that you get from people, okay. Right? So one of the things that's interesting. So you put something on. So I think this fascinating idea that you're sitting in your bedroom and you put something on. So the lockdown dynamic, where the feedback is sort of, it comes in dribs and drabs, can be quite echo chambery versus the live performance. How was that lockdown experience? Was that tough? Or was it easier in many respects because you could just kind of do what you wanted to do, and you didn't have that immediate sense of critique from people?
Sure. I mean, it was different, I would say. I think if you're performing live, you get an instant feedback in terms of like people laughing, but you don't necessarily know how they're taking that or whether the laughter is irony deaf or not. I mean, normally it doesn't. I don't feel like it is when I perform live to the audiences. They seem to be pretty bright, the people that... It's quite a lot of academics and lawyers and all that kind of stuff. So they obviously get it. They obviously take me as the genius that I am.
They haven't seen through the character.
It's an interesting one because on Twitter, it became very addictive. Like, that process of like just constantly like, watching the news all the time because we had nothing else to do. Like, and being like, okay, what's Rafe going to say? How am I going to do a video on this? How am I going to do this? And I really felt like I was riding a wave. I mean, it was wild. Like it was really, and everyone was much more engaged in their phones anyway, so engagement was really up. And yeah, I mean, the serotonin and dopamine was palpable. And my girlfriend at the time used to help and film content and stuff, and I used to really enjoy it. I mean, I it was weird, wasn't it? Because it was obviously like such a grim time for so many people and such a sort of anxiety-inducing time and isolating time. But in the same sense, like I quite like that. I was like, right, I get up, I churn out some content. It feels very nice to have people on the internet, like loads of people liking it and saying, "Oh, you're so funny" or whatever, And sometimes after a live show, they kind of come and they laugh and then they leave, and you're sort of like,
have they left in disgust? Or they right?
Yeah, it almost, which is obviously silly because it's like a room full of people have laughed for an hour. But I don't know. That's like, I guess that's a post-lockdown experience that I was like, oh, I hope they liked it. And none of them are messaging me directly being like, that show changed my life. They must have hated it, which is so fucking dumb when I say it out loud. Of course it is. But yeah, they're good in different ways. Like there's nothing like a joke landing and a whole room full of people laughing. I mean, that's insane. Like there's nothing like that. So yeah, they're different. I don't, I wouldn't go back to lockdown, but the stuff online was great.
We will be soon.
Yeah,
worry.
yeah. By the looks of
it, there's an interesting, and maybe I'm just seeing this, or I'm conscious of that, but there was an interesting seam of you, Michael Spicer. I've forgotten her name. The lady in the US who did the Trump video, Sarah. Yeah. All of which is sort of taking news events and just shifting the context slightly. Yeah. And I wondered, were you conscious of other people doing similar things? Are you watching what they're doing?
Yeah, I tried. I think the thing is, I tried not to watch that stuff. Like, I don't watch like Jonathan Pye or Michael Spicer or Alistair Green, or just because they're good, more established. I would worry that I'd copy them. Do you know what I mean? I feel like
because it would subliminally just, even if you didn't mean to, you're not plagiarizing, but yeah, it's going to influence you.
I mean, when I started doing stand-up initially, like it was, you just end up like, I will go and watch James Acaster routines and I'll just come out and do a really shit impression of James Acaster when I could have done a good one, and that was rubbish. But it was because you watch these people, you're like, oh my God, they're so good. I want to try and do that, but you're not fully formed enough as an act to then actually go and create something that's meaningfully distinct. So you just end up regurgitating their stuff. And I was worried that would happen. And actually, I think that the place I've got to as a stand-up now and as someone who's writing comedy and everything, I've tried, and it kind of harks back to what we were talking about with like just setting yourself free and just not having any speed bumps between what your brain comes up with and what you say. I just do stuff because I think it's funny now. And because in my head, I'm like, this is good. I'm going to say this because I recognize this would be funny as people look at me, rather than, oh, this comic had this routine. I'll kind of base what I'm doing on that, because then it just becomes way too derivative, and people sniff that out, right? That said, I do always get told that, oh, Rafe is train guy, and I'm just like, fuck off. I did, Bob Mortimer's train guy.
Yeah.
I find that so annoying because I'm just like, it just isn't. And also, like, what if people are like, oh, he's just look at him, he's plagiarizing Train Guy. And it's like, well, what if me and Bob Mortimer have both seen overly hubristic, yuppie men? What if that is what it is? Rather than I'm looking at Bob Mortimer, who's obviously brilliant by all accounts, but also I'm pretty sure I did Rafe on Twitter before Bob Mortimer did Train Guy.
Right.
So I just found that annoying, but whatever. People are going to, like Jordan Peterson says, he's like, people are always going to misrepresent you. My absolute hero, Jordan Peterson, and his lovely. No. Let's not get into that.
Are there people that just don't find it funny?
Yeah, I think there are people who find it maybe facile, or someone. I think someone was like, which it is, obviously.
That's why it's funny.
There was someone like, oh, there are children dying, and this person's just doing an Ian Hislop impression or whatever. And I was like, well, yeah, but I never claimed to change the world. Do you know what I mean? It just comes from this bizarre perspective of what satire is, or whatever it is, whatever it is I'm doing is. And I just find that really odd. And, the biggest thing I find weird is people who are outside of the genre, who haven't contributed to the genre, who are these sort of self-identifying experts on it. You know, like I just find that really bizarre. Them being like, "Well, this isn't what this is supposed to be. This is this," and I'm like, "Well." This is why I have a bit of a gripe with the concept of an arts critic, because I'm just like, you have to do it. You have to do it to know. What comedians have to say about what I do is nearly always the most, like, they understand it best, and also they give the fairest critiques, much more so than critics, I would argue, because they live it and that's their lives. And I just find it so odd, that ridiculous confidence that people have, but for something, comedy, which is basically just feeling around in the dark and being like, I think this is funny. I think I'm getting a sense of this is sort of, maybe this works or whatever. But, comedians don't totally know either. And I just find it so odd that people online seem to be so secure and assured of their own opinions about what that particular type of thing is and ought to be, and all of that. I just find that really, but I'm a person who's really riddled with uncertainty and 3 different opinions on things, and I'm like, do I think this or this? I don't know. But I guess a lot of people aren't like that.
But it's weird because it's almost like it's approaching it like, people go, well, let's take a haiku, right? Very defined what that is and what it is not. Strict rules around it. And so something like that, you can go, that is a haiku, that is not, right? It's a very binary thing. Whereas what you do, there are no rules, right? No one's sort of gone, oh, this is what comedy is supposed to be and this isn't, right? The whole point is you're being playful and experimenting. Yeah. And so I find it weird that sort of, you can say, I don't find that funny, right? Legit response, but the kind of, I will tell you, hey, you should have done it this way. Right? There are no rules.
Absolutely. I mean, and obviously we can sort of push ourselves in the direction of what something might mean, and you can look at set like plays in comedy that work. Like, for example, subverting expectation is like a classic way of telling a joke. But there are plenty of things that are funny that don't necessarily subvert expectations. I mean, you cannot slap that singular criterion on all things that are funny. Like, so yeah, that's an issue that I have. Just I think people from the outside, people who don't do it, seem really like assured of what it is, and actually it's so much more complicated, in my opinion, than that. And anyone who tells you they have all the answers about it is lying, because like but that's the joy. It's like, you're never going to win at comedy. That's how I feel about it. Like, it doesn't matter how big a venue you play. It doesn't matter how well the show goes, how well you rip it. You're never going to win. You're always going to be like, what's the next gig? What's the next routine? What's the next joke I'm going to do? And there's something that's kind of harrowing about that. But there's something that's completely thrilling, and I find very fulfilling, even though it's so hollow. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense, because I guess if you ever felt satisfied, right, you would probably lose some of that ability, that creative ability.
You lose the excitement, and every time you get up there on stage, it's a gamble every time, and that's what's a thrill. It's like you're taming a beast every time you go on and do it, and it's like you get better at that as time goes on. But yeah, there's nothing like it in that regard. And I think that's why it tends to attract people that get very bored easily, and it tends to attract like quite high achievers and people who are like super brainy, because you're looking for added stimulation in your life. Jimmy Carr strikes me as a perfect example of that. He strikes me as the kind of guy who would get extremely bored very easily, and is super switched on and super ambitious and obviously super bright.
Yeah, and it struck me that there's ideas fighting to come out, and it's a vehicle for that expression.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a perfect description of it. It's like, normally, Dave Chappelle talks about this in the Mark Twain Prize. He's like, whether I agree or disagree with the comedian, all practitioners of this art form, like, I'm paraphrasing, but he's like, all practitioners of this art form I respect, because they've noticed something and they want to explain it to you, or they want to tell you something that matters to them. And normally it comes from like being high functioning and having all these ideas that you want to express, or funny little things like, oh, what would it be like if this happened, or whatever. And you want people to listen to that, and you want to be noticed. And yeah, it's I think that's it. It's those like ideas that are fighting to come out, and that's what I felt with Rafe in the pandemic. I was like, I'm pissed off at how the government have dealt with this. I think they've done an awful job, and I wanted to express that, and that's why anger can be good for comedy. I don't think it's essential, but I think it can be really helpful in that regard if controlled, in the right way.
I was as reflecting as you were talking. Actually, that's probably why. So one, I'm attracted to it because I recognise the character from my previous lives and probably present. But I think there's also a certain amount of I just want somebody to kind of like call this out, right, and make a statement on it. And I think particularly where and this is why I love the name hubris, right, because that is precisely what we see going on. And so you've got, I think you were in many respects, sort of like a way of looking at and going, oh, right, okay, good. Somebody in a higher and higher profile place is kind of punching back a bit, and sort of calling this stuff out in a way that reassures me. Well, I guess reassures me I'm not going mad.
I think that's it, isn't it? It's like the catharsis that people enjoy because we've all, I think that's probably why quite a lot of academics come to watch me live, because they've had to deal with those people in academic contexts who are just full of all that bluster, but just completely, just lacking in substance. And I think it's that. I think it is that sort of shared catharsis because everyone's had to suffer at the hands of a rave, be it in a conversation at a party or wherever, and I think it is that. And I think for me, it's like me doing that and also probably recognizing, well, I think I'm being a bit harsh on myself to say that I was like that, but recognizing a bit that maybe some people thought that about me historically. I'm trying to reconstruct myself by looking down aggressively on former me. But yeah, it's interesting though, because it's fortunate because all that type of young, posh Clapham dwelling man, they're identicate. They all follow the similar trends. They all wear similar clothes. They all say similar things, and that is sort of a gift. In a way, it was an easy character to create because it's like, well, we know these people. They're everywhere.
But the interesting thing I found, and you joked around this around your tour, is sort of parts of the country where you might expect this to land and parts where you wouldn't. And so I could see that people in London or people with our sort of backgrounds would immediately go, oh, I've seen someone, I recognize that. But it also, and this is, I got to be really careful here because I don't know, but I'm making a presumption. It seems to also land outside that.
Yeah, I that has been my experience. But then I sort of what you kind of realize is that there's posh people everywhere. So that leads like people from Harrogate and stuff. But yeah, I played to different types of people. I play to, well, what I'm trying to play to, and certainly what I want my audience to be, is the middle third of the political spectrum. Like that's who I want to put, because in my opinion, those are the people with like the most sensible opinions who are willing to like have a bit of a laugh and a joke at their own expense because they're willing to trade in their opinions relative to reason and all that stuff. And then as you get outside of that, obviously to the far right and the far left, humor does diminish a little bit. That's how I feel, having toured up and down the UK. And I actually remember being very pleasantly surprised at like how up for a laugh a lot of the Tories that came to watch me were, because I assumed that they would be like, oh, you shouldn't be taking the piss out of us like this, that's not funny. But actually, to be fair to them, they can really have a laugh at themselves. And obviously I get all the sort of people from my political sort of belief stance, like the centre left liberal people. But yeah, I mean, I say that's kind of broadly who comes to watch me. So even in the north, like Manchester's obviously super posh, and I get people from Didsbury coming and all of that, which I've ripped the piss out of them for. So yeah, to be honest, I just play to the rich really, and they kind of are varying in their political opinions. Some are self-denying and full of contradictions and left-wing like me, and then others are the sort of centre-right. But yeah, I've got to be honest. I find it really funny when people come to my shows and they've dressed as Rafe, and and they're willing to like.
It's like cosplay.
Yeah. We're interacting together, and that we're playing the show together, And they're up for it. Like, there was a bloke in the front row, and I was doing a joke about privatising the NHS, and I was like, give it a couple of years, we'll have the whole thing privatised. Classic. And there's this guy who I'd ascertained was a Tory in the front row, and I was like, "Come on, mate, give me a fist bump." And he didn't want to do it because obviously that didn't represent his opinions, but he played along and he did it in the end. And I was like, that's great. That's what I want. I want people to. I don't want people just because they're on the right to feel alienated. In the same way that if I were doing a left-wing character, I wouldn't want left-wing people to not be able to laugh at that, because I think you have to sort of be able to talk truthfully about both wings of the political spectrum if this is what you want to do, and you can't be afraid of upsetting like your tribe. And obviously, like, I know what my tribe is, but yeah, you can't be afraid of upsetting those people, because as soon as people start to smell a little bit of fear, you're fucked artistically, because then what you're saying is just pandering, I think.
Right. And I was intrigued by a comment I read you made somewhere about, right-wing people seem to have more of a sense of humor.
Yeah.
Right. So you're allowed to take the piss out of them in a way that, criticized Jeremy Corbyn, and you get the acolytes come down on you in a way that I suspect, from what you were saying, doesn't necessarily happen at the other end. I mean, there'll always be criticism, but
I think that is definitely a quote that's been attributed to me. I don't know whether in the whole article, I think the point is slightly different. I understand why they would have gone with that quote, because it obviously totally appeals to their readership, and that's completely fair enough. I think what I was trying to say was, I think the right have a very good and very efficient mechanism for feedback. They take feedback well. They're happy for people to rip the piss out of them, and they'll be, like Boris Johnson will be there smiling on "Have I got news for you?" going, "Ha ha ha, that's embarrassing about Darius Guppy. Let's move on."
Right.
I don't think we tend to see that as much with the left. Certainly when they're in power. I mean, obviously Ed Miliband has been hilarious. Like since he stepped down as
yeah. Where was that at the time? I would have loved a bit of that at the time.
So my theory on why that doesn't exist is because, if you're on the left, arguably, all of your contentions are about, well, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but a lot of your contentions are about morality, right? So, the right can divert because it stops us from acknowledging the sort of glaring flaws in the system. And they can use humor to do that, which is very charismatic and engaging and funny and interesting. But I feel like if you're on the left, you have to constantly be like, well, hang on a second. I think it's pretty outrageous that the right are doing X, Y, and Z. And I think it's very hard to be funny in that regard. So I think people tend to struggle a bit more. But then that's a slightly different, but again, that's a different point from, I guess, what I was saying in that article, which was like the feedback mechanism for the left. They just don't tend to subscribe to the philosophy, or maybe the hard left doesn't tend to subscribe to the philosophy that maybe we could learn something from criticism that's leveled at us. And in my experience, the right tends to subscribe to that a bit more. But what I mean by the right is obviously, I mean the center right. Do you know what I mean? I don't mean, obviously, I don't mean the far right. And that looks a bit misleading when I'm like left and right. I mean the hard left. Because I think the centre left can take criticism and is aware. I mean the hard left, and I mean the centre right. So, yeah, I think. But I think people. I think that's a fair. I don't think that's a particularly controversial statement to say that the left tend to be a bit more humorless. But then equally, you can take the piss out of the royal family or soldiers, and the right hate that. So,
yeah.
I think it's a bit more complicated than that quote that was attributed to me, and I think my beliefs on it are a bit more sort of nuanced than
right.
Hopefully, as that gets across. But equally, I understand why they would run with that as a headline, because it seems quite inflammatory and it's interesting for their readers. But I've pissed off plenty of people on the right doing Rafe, and they can be extremely pompous. And actually, I think they're quite a good mirror to the hard left. I think they're equally pompous groups in society. So. Yeah, I don't know if that's totally representative, to be honest, of what I actually think, but fair, fine. That's fair. Well, I don't begrudge the Telegraph for doing that. Do you see what I mean? Like,
No, I know exactly what you mean, right? And I guess the price you pay for getting the sort of front page cover,
sure,
that doesn't make any sense at all. You know what I mean? Appearing on the front page.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Like that is the price you pay. You're going to, they've got a readership. They want to adhere to that reader. They want to give the readership what that readership wants to hear. Of course they do. In the same way that, like, if in the Guardian I was like, I don't know, I was hammering the elite, that they would probably want to use a quote like that, and I get that. That's fine. I think in the article, to be fair, they do a very good job of, like, fairly representing kind of what I have to say about things. But I'm sure you'll have ascertained from this conversation, Christian, that I've got a lot of sort of meandering beliefs about various things, but I'm also very willing to trade them in. I actually, if we're talking about human decision making, I actually think that there's an interesting point in that if you're making a character about someone, you're constantly observing and checking that your observations match to previous observations, and then sort of forming general laws. And I say that's exactly how I think across the board. Like, in terms of arguments and philosophical positions, like, I'm constantly willing to trade in my beliefs if, like, a better one shows up. In the same way that I'm constantly willing to adapt Rafe if I feel like I've had a really good set of observations that confirm a specific element of his character,
I love that. And that's the difference between the student me and the now me. I just sort of go, actually, these sort of rabid positions that it's easy to hold when you have zero responsibility and have read a little bit, right? And sort of had to, whereas you then, to your point earlier around you get into the adult world, you're like, Christ, this is a bit more difficult, a bit more complicated. Sure. I think I like to think of myself as having fairly solid principles and flexible views on things. And that's the way I sort of have that kind of moral. I'm not sure that always works, but that's the basic principle. And I think that's quite refreshingly honest, right? Yeah. Because that reflects the fact that the world isn't simple. And actually, we don't know everything. And do you know what? Sometimes I come up with stupid ideas, and they're worth chucking out when I recognize.
Absolutely,
them.
But I think that's like that's the premise on which we build science, right? Like, it's like do you know what I mean? Like, it's like you've observed more data points, so you change the theory to match the data points, and I think any rational human being should operate in that way. And I think it also means, like, just applying. It's just intellectual humility, isn't it? It's like, I'm very aware that a lot of what I have to think about things isn't necessarily that well informed. And even the things I've thought a lot about, like comedy and satire, like, I can't, like, I'm so far from the world authority on that. And I could give you maybe some opinions about something or other, but equally, like, it's just complicated. And I think anyone who tells you that this is, I guess that's my gripe with people outside of the genre being like, this is what comedy is and you're not doing this, or this is what satire. Like, I'm just like, how are you so secure in that? Because I do it much more than you, and I'm not at all. So yeah, I think that's super important, and I guess that's why I want to play to the middle third, because I feel like the middle third politically represent that type of viewpoint most effectively.
But this is like, you've heard of Dunning-Kruger effect. Yeah, I mean, this is classic that, right? So I've seen it. I've watched some comedians, so I'm an expert in it.
Yeah, right, of course. And but I've gone through stages like that with politics, like where, I'd advanced positions that were sort of aggressively left-wing, that were often, I think in the pandemic, a lot of the aggressively left-wing takes I really agreed with and thought were true. Like, I don't even know if it was left-wing, but like, I agreed with a lot of what Owen Jones had to say during the pandemic about, government scrutiny and everything, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I also sort of, I guess now, like, I sort of look at a lot more things, and because we're in a less polarized time, right? Because life is carrying on, and, we're not in a lockdown. That the government are doing a bit better, we'd all have to agree, than in March of 2020, right? So I'm just much more inclined to sort of, like, entertain 3 or 4 different viewpoints at once, and maybe sometimes that can make it a little bit more difficult to do comedy, because you kind of need a sort of set of parameters that you can play off in order to do it effectively, I would argue. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's also just like a classic comedian's brain. Like, that is how it's just constantly turning stuff over and constantly reassessing things and constantly like reflecting. I think it just goes with the territory. And like, I guess all my life I've sort of been like that, and doing philosophy as well. Like, it's all, I don't know. Yeah, it feels kind of like it's been leading to this, even though maybe I didn't realize it.
So it's also really easy to retrofit a story, right? Because you sort of go, and then logically this happened.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. Yeah, like the puddle, talking about how perfectly designed the hole that it finds itself in is for it.
Right.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's just the chance of rain.
Right.
I think that's true. But I don't know. I just find ideas so interesting, and I really struggle with people who sort of are just so assured of their view of the world and are really rigid thinkers, because I just think, like, no one knows, you know. And I love the sort of endeavor of working out loads of stuff, and yeah. And I think comedy, to a very large extent, is really tied to that for me.
Amazing. I could keep talking forever. I'm going to let you go at this point, because this you've been absolutely phenomenal.
Christian, thanks for having me, man. I've really enjoyed talking to you. And thank you for your review. It was so nice, and so like you clearly like really thought about it and really had a great knowledge of it all. And you know, I could tell that as the writer. So that was really, really nice. I appreciate it.
I hate these reviews that are used to great.
Sure.
Right. Well, that's fucking useless, right? I can tell that from your star rating. Sure. Right, whether you think it's good or bad. So give me something to work with. And it was funny because the other bit, and I've now, and I've bought the audiobook now that's out, because I'm like, because blindingly obvious, right? But you find yourself reading it in your voice, or Rafe's voice. Sure. There was that little clip about the Mrs. Hancock's ham sandwich, right? which I heard on, and I was just like, oh. I can't remember what it was. There was something in the way that you pronounced it that I hadn't done when I read it. And I was like, I really want to hear it again.
But that's it. There's so many more jokes. Well, I genuinely found, like, doing the audiobook, you just double the number of jokes almost. So like every time, it doesn't totally match the transcript of the book, right? So like every time he mentions Oxford, I will always get closer to the mic and be like, where I studied. Like, and then you're right. You know what I mean? So there's so much. Yeah, no, the audiobook was really fun. I think that because, you know, I do all the impressions in it, so that brings it to life a lot more, and you feel like you're really there. And
so, Josh, as I knew it would, time has just passed by. Thank you so much for spending the time to come on the podcast. Before I let you go, can you tell people where they can get hold of the book and find you on tour?
I mean, the best place is probably my website, which is Josh Berry Official. It sounds very up itself, Josh Berry Official. The reason it's called Josh Berry Official is because I've noticed how many times I'm getting in Josh Berry Official, just so no one doesn't know what it is. There's some wanker NASCAR driver in America who's nicked joshberry.com. So it's awful. I'm trying to sue him. I'm trying to have him killed, so I can reclaim the domain. But anyway, yeah, it's joshberryofficial.com, and that's got my tour and the book on there. And you can get the audiobook on Amazon, on Audible via Amazon, which is very exciting. I think that's got to be the hardest I've worked on something. I think the audiobook, and it was an absolute slog. I think it's a really good piece of work, if I say so myself, if that's all right. And yeah, I hope the people listening to this, it's very good Christmas listening, I think, you know. So don't hang out with your family. All that smouldering resentment that you feel towards your parents and, you know, your family, just go away into the spare room, if you have a spare room, or not, and just put your earphones in the sissy room. I don't care. Just buy it. That's what I'm trying to say.
Amazing. And in case anybody can't remember Josh Berry Official, there is, of course, a link to that and all the other things we talked about in the show notes.
Huge.
So that's it for this second episode of my discussion with Josh Berry. My enormous thanks to Josh for appearing and being such a great guest, and to you for listening. To find out more about Josh, the fabulous Rafe Hubris Diaries, his tour, and all the other things he's up to, visit joshberryofficial.com. You'll also find links to Josh's social media accounts in the show notes. Given recent events in the UK, you'll find that Rafe Hubris has been a lot busier than he has before, and Josh has been producing some absolutely fabulous clips that I highly recommend you go check out. If you're new to the Human Risk podcast, thank you so much for listening. Do subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. You can find out more about me and the work I do on human risk at human-risk.com. There you can discover some resources to help you manage human risk and some of the details of work that I do for my clients to help them manage theirs. I'll be back soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, manage your hubris, and thanks for listening.